Professor Marya Schechtman in a conversation about personal identity. Schechtman is professor of philosophy and member of the Laboratory of Integrative Neuroscience at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Schechtman studies the problem of personal identity and of personal survival through approaches based in psychological continuity, as well as autobiographical narrative self-constitution. She has extended these approaches with an emphasis on empathic access, and a focus on both internal and external treatment as persisting subjects. The interview is conducted by Dr. Randall Kuhner.
With the questions that I sent you, you have a fair idea of what sort of things, the people that I've spoken with before and the people who are in our audience are curious about. And of course, a lot of those questions are extremely common. They're the ones that you're very, very much used to, I'm sure, because they pop up all the time when people debate personal identity.
Right.
Yeah, but if you don't mind, we can dive right in, and I can just ask you, I guess, the big question, which is, and by the way, Michael, I assume we're recording, right?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So, how should we think about the sense of self and personal identity? If we think of a person, what does it require for a person to survive so that they can say, I am today the same person that I was yesterday?
Well, that is a big question. And I think that it's sort of hopeless to try to answer it as a uniform question. So it has to be sort of chopped into little questions. And one of the big ones, I think, and have come to think over the course of working on this, over the time I've worked on it, is that people are sometimes asking a question about whether you're the same person to other people, whether other people can re-identify you as the same person, whether they can know you as the same person, you're the same person to them. And sometimes they're asking the survival question you asked. What would it be for me to survive? What does that mean? Which is asking, what am I? So there's sort of a self question and a person question as one way of phrasing that. There's, myself, what I am to myself, my sense of self, what would be survival for me? And then there's, how do you know that this person in front of you is the same person who you met 3 weeks ago or 3 years ago or whatever? And those aren't exactly the same question, but they probably should have something to do with one another. And I think that one of the interesting questions is, what do they have to do with one another? And I think that this has been at the heart of a lot of philosophical discussion about this, and also popular thought about it, sci-fi and so on, which is, to what extent do I need to be the same person for other people to be the same person for myself? How much is being the same self or being the same person connected to the ways in which I'm able to carry on relationships and interactions with people? So I think, we get into, that's one way of chopping it up. And then there's another way of chopping it up, which I think the question, which has to do with something that you could call a more literal and a more metaphorical sense of self, although I don't know that that's the best way to put it, which is we often talk about becoming a different person, if, either from the inside or the outside, if somebody changes a lot, if they undergo a religious conversion, if they change their political views, if they get old and jaded and, lose all their dreams and so on. But we don't really mean that they've become a different thing in some sense, right? Because one of the reasons it's so disturbing when someone changes that way is because you think that in some sense they really are still the same person, but they've changed so much as if they're someone else. So there's the question of, am I the same person that I was as a teenager, where we seem to be asking questions about how much I've changed, when there's no question whatsoever or for most people, that I've survived since my teen years, right? I didn't cease to exist or anything. In some sense, it's clearly still me. So there's a lot of space there, and maybe I'll stop for a minute and see which part of it you want to.
Yeah, I mean, both parts are really interesting if there is a large amount of debate about both parts. We've mostly talked about the second one, about how you can tell if you yourself have survived, if you are still the same person, because it seemed as if the other question was, mm, if not easy, at least one where there seemed to be more consensus. Um, but that may be wrong because I'm not an expert, that's for sure. Um, Now, I'm interested though because you mentioned that in some sense we don't assume that a person can really become a different person um, just because they were different as a person in terms of characteristics when they were 5 years old or now. Um, but I mean, one could otherwise, or could just posit that those two things are completely separated, that personal identity and personal survival, that they are just that they're, the connection is very tenuous, that say you could survive but be a different person, just like say someone who has dementia may not remember anything about their previous self and be a very different person. Um, so I'm wondering, I mean, is it just that we have intuitions about if this person has the same body, then this is the same person? That's what makes us say, no, obviously this has to still be the same person, even if they seem really different. Or would it be more correct to say, yes, we can become different persons? Our personal identity can change so much that you could say the same person has not survived, um, even in the same body.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a, I mean, that really is in a nutshell much of the history of the debate on personal identity in philosophy. And I think over the years it sort of spread into that first question I asked. So maybe I'll start with this one and we'll see if we get to the other one
Yeah,
or
sure.
not.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of the way that philosophers talk about personal identity now comes from John Locke, who was hardly the first person to think of this, but was the first person to write about it in this way, who just said, look, it's one thing to be, he said, the same man, I'll say the same human organism. It's one thing to be the same human organism. It's another thing to be the same person. These are just two different concepts, and they can come apart. So in our world, for the most part, you get one person, one organism, but as you say, not always, because some people would say you don't have a personal identity when you're an infant. The organism is there, but there's no actual person there yet. Or that if you get very severe dementia, or certainly if you fall into a vegetative state from which you never recover, you might want to say the person is gone, but the human organism is still there. And if somebody changes enough in other ways, right, then
Mhm.
you might say the same thing. So, so Locke says that personal identity consists in sameness of consciousness. Unfortunately, he doesn't exactly tell us what sameness of consciousness is.
Yeah.
So some people read this as meaning, usually people read it as meaning memory, saying, look, I'm the same person as an earlier person because I have these memories. I don't think that's a very good reading, but that's a long story we don't need to get
Mhm.
into. But what I take him to be saying is something like, look, if you have the choice of, for you or someone you love, their consciousness continuing or this sort of lump of stuff continuing, you're probably going to go for the consciousness. Um,
Mhm.
in our observation, you usually have to have the lump of stuff continuing and working pretty well for the consciousness to continue, but certainly there are
Yeah.
many religious traditions in which consciousness continues after the death of the body. There are reports of near-death experiences which, whether you accept them or not, right, are descriptions of what it would be like for consciousness to continue separate from the body. So it seems that, right, you might care about both in different ways, but it certainly seems imaginable that your consciousness could continue, and so you as a self could continue, whether your body did or not.
Right.
And then we have plenty of fables, and again, science fiction abounds, right? We got all kinds of stories where people are in different bodies through enchantment or technology or whatever you want, right? Or worlds in which when your body wears out, you get a new one. And wouldn't you count that as a form of survival? Wouldn't you just get moved to the new body
Mm-hmm.
in such a case? And so that's the intuition that people are after. But then the tricky part is saying, what does it mean for your consciousness to continue? Really, how do we know when that's happened? I wake up each morning. How do I know that my morning consciousness is a continuation of my going to bed, of the going to bed consciousness of whoever was there, right?
Yes, how indeed. Yeah.
Oh, indeed, yes.
Because, I mean, it could all just be the last 20 seconds, right? The memories are all fake, and we were just created 20 seconds ago. Yeah.
That,
We don't assume that that's the case because it seems a little bit extraordinary. But yeah, strictly speaking, we don't know.
right, and then, a philosopher named Derek Parfit put pressure on the idea by saying, well, it's not just worrying about whether that actually did happen to you, but what you should worry about is if you can't say how you could tell the difference between whether it did or didn't, then just how deep a thing is this sameness of consciousness anyway? So the way he puts it is, if you think there's a difference between getting incinerated and having a replica made with a bunch of fake memories and really continuing to exist, tell me what that difference is. If you can't tell, either before or after, right? How can it really be different? How can we care so much about the continuation of our consciousness when we don't even know whether it's happening or not?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So this is actually a great point to continue, because I know that this is where we get into a lot of the main issues that get debated around this notion that our foundation is most interested in, namely this what if you could do neural prosthesis where you can replace parts of the brain or you could replace all of the brain, and what would that be like, and what would it mean to say you can survive something like that? Now, you mentioned Derek Parfit, and of course, Parfit is the one to point to who would say, well, all of these things probably don't matter so much um, if you constructed a person with the same brain that you have somewhere elsewhere on the planet, and whether whatever the reason for that, whether there is even a causal connection or not. At some point, he even gave up on the idea that there had to be a causal connection. This could be construed as you surviving that procedure. Now, from the limited reading that I've done of your previous materials, and some of it was unfortunately a bit old. I just read one that was from 2001. It seemed to me that you agree in part with Derek Parfit's approach, but you don't really agree with either his conclusion or that it was quite enough. And I believe you introduced notions such as empathic access, and I'm very curious to understand more about where you take a different path than, say, with Derek Parfit.
Well, so the empathic access thing is yet another thing in a way. So let me try to go in stages. It's always so hard because I'm trying to say everything, and I'm trying to think of what's really crucial here. So I think Parfit raises a real challenge. I mean, it bothered me a lot, not just as a philosopher who had to respond to it, but as a person thinking, yeah, it seems so important for my consciousness to continue. And yet, what is the difference between getting replicated and continuing? Well, the obvious difference is it's, a different mechanism that's generating the consciousness, but why should that matter? I never cared about that before, and our cells are turning over, so who cares, right? Stuff is changing in our body all the time. It's never really the same stuff, so why would it matter? The sort of cases, that you raise. what if, someone just took out my brain and put in a prosthetic one? And one thing I want to say is that over time, I've really come to believe that a lot of this is a kind of empirical question in a strange way. So, Parfit never worries about whether this kind of technology is possible or not, because he said it doesn't matter whether it's possible. This is a thought experiment.
Mm-hmm.
What if this could happen? If you can imagine it and you don't know what to say about it, you've got the same problem. But I think it will be interesting to see as it becomes more possible to really have interventions and technologies that substantially change the way we think about our embodiment.
Yeah.
What happens to our concerns about survival, our notions about identity? They might change in ways so that there's no longer a yes/no answer to the question. So one of the thought experiments that Parfit uses, as I'm sure you're well aware, and again, it's a plot in lots and lots of stories throughout history, is one where someone somehow splits in two, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you think, well, if my consciousness continues on, right, even if I had to put it in another body, but it was my consciousness, that would be me. Well, once you can do it once, you can do it twice, right? Because some way or other, you'll be able to replicate the thing. So what if somehow, instead of making one copy of me, which I would have been content with and thought was me, you make two? I can't be identical to two people, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can't be both of them, but I'm not just one or just the other. So then what happens to me, and what Parfit concludes there is, well, I don't, strictly speaking, continue to exist. But because I can't be identical to two future people, so I can't be both of them, and I'm not one or the other. The most obvious thing to say is I went out of existence, but I still have everything I care about. Double.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point, because when it comes to those kinds of, I guess right now they're still thought experiments, but in some future case they may not be just thought experiments. Oftentimes this leads to this strange construct where a claim could be made where if you just make one copy and the original can't survive that process or whatever, then it's fine, because then you just have one identity continuing and therefore you survived. But if you have two copies or three copies or four, then you're branching into so many copies that all share your memories and your characteristics, and all of them are completely convinced that they are you, because you could construct them in an isolated room where they have no idea that there are any other copies. But somehow having multiples would then mean that you didn't survive, because your identity can't possibly be duplicated. But if there was only one, then you would. But how could survival possibly depend on something like that, especially if you didn't necessarily even know whether there were any duplicates? So that becomes sort of paradoxical, and it, to me, it seems like that just points to the fact that this formal notion of identity, and identities therefore not being able to be duplicated, that's where it kind of falls down. That really the survival of the self is not not that much linked to this formal notion of personal identity. Would you agree with that, or is that kind of a
Well,
wrong way to think about it?
I definitely agree with that. Parfit says that, and I agree with it. And then I think this is where sort of this second question goes back to the first question about being the same to yourself and being the same for other people. Because one of the things I think is, in a world where we could duplicate people, we would probably have very different relationships to other people. I mean, our practices would probably develop along with the technology, as they always do, so that our interactions, I mean, one of the things I think about is, well, suppose, your parent gets cloned, right? You're a 10-year-old and dad gets split in two. Well, it's not quite the same as still having dad there, but it's certainly not like dad dying, right? You have a relationship to both of these individuals that is neither the same as your relationship when they're unique, nor the relationship when they're different, and just everything would be different. As a philosopher named Kathleen Wilk said, how would universities work if people could double all the time? Like, how do you figure out your enrollments and how many seats you need in the classes and who pays tuition and who gets the degree and so on.
Yeah.
So things would just be organized differently. But that doesn't mean you wouldn't survive, but it might mean that what we thought of as survival had a slightly different character. I think, the stuff that's coming out of a lot of philosophy is a very individualistic notion of my consciousness is like a well-defined stream that goes forward. And so one of the things Parker talks about is you would have everything you want in survival or everything that matters to you about life and survival if you split. But things would be so different. Maybe you wouldn't have everything you wanted in survival, but you would have other things. So he always says, look, suppose you wanted both to, write a great novel and be a great athlete. I can't remember exactly what his example is, but you can't do both. Well, if you split, then you can do both. So, one continuer goes one way and writes the novel, and the other goes the other way and gets the athletic training. But it's not the same as doing both, right? Because each one would still be frustrated by not being able to do the other.
Yeah.
And each might be even more frustrated by there being someone else who did it, who's getting all the acclaim, who looks just like them and used all their prep work and stuff from years before. So it's when you try to imagine in real detail what this would look like, I sort of think it's not not for nothing that in a lot of science fiction where doubling is possible, there are laws against it.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's a matter of degrees because, we do accept identical twins who are raised by the same parents and under the same circumstances, but who go off and lead different lives. And we simply have a way of dealing with the fact that there are identical twins out there who maybe even have similar personalities and characteristics, and they may share some memories because they experienced some things together, and other things they may not share memories of. So that's somewhat different than the duplication experiment, of course, but it does seem like it's more a matter of degrees than something that is completely different.
Well, except that when you talk about the survival of the twins, having one of them survive is different from having the other one survive.
Sure, yeah.
Right.
And it seems to me that you could make the case that the same thing is true when you duplicate. If you
Absolutely.
duplicate and then you have years of experience that are different, then you've got two people. Each of them has the same desire to continue living and the right to be seen as, a person in their own right. You couldn't say, well, it's okay as long as one of them survives. Yeah.
Right, but I think so I think what Parfit would say is, look, all you need is someone psychologically continuous to survive. So whether one or two or, righty or lefty survives, it doesn't matter. And I think that is what I'm trying to say. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think what Parfit does is more than put pressure on the idea that the logical notion of identity is the important thing, or personal identity. And now I think he shows very effectively, look, that's not what we really care about in survival. And I think maybe if you weren't a philosopher, it never would have occurred to you that when you want to survive, what you want is for there to be someone in the future who is identical to you. What you really want is for your, I think he's right, your consciousness to go forward into the future. But then I think he does such a good job of saying, so why do you want that? What does that get you? Why is it better for you to continue than, say, to have a replica of you built or 10 replicas of you built? Or so.
It also.
So I think that.
Yeah. It isn't even clear when someone says something like you want your consciousness to continue into the future, what that actually means. It's like in some other cases where you've pointed out, for instance, that people who talk about psychological continuity need to make a case as to what that really means, that kind of continuity. Similarly, when someone says they want their consciousness to continue into the future, they need to make very clear what it is they mean by that, because you could say that all you mean by your consciousness continues into the future is that there is someone in the future who has a brain from which emerges a conscious experience that has all of the qualities of your previous conscious experience and all the memories. If you try to make a different case, a case that has something to do with a continuing stream of consciousness, then you would have to show that that somehow personal survival isn't violated, or that it's essential for the survival of the self in cases where clearly the stream of consciousness does break. So when you're under anesthesia, or there are even more extreme cases like when people are, temporarily deceased as because they've slipped under the ice and their body is cooled down to the point where there is absolutely no brain activity, but they are still brought back maybe an hour later, maybe even longer than that. Most of us wouldn't say that the person hasn't survived,
Right.
even though their brain was completely inactive. Although I suppose someone who was very strict about their belief in continuing some sort of subset of brain activity or something like that, that was absolutely essential. They could say, no, this is just someone who behaves exactly like them, but really that person has died. But typically we don't say that. So it becomes extremely difficult to defend the point where you say, well, your consciousness has to somehow survive into the future, to point out exactly what it is that that couldn't make it through if, say, you used a teleporter or
Right.
let's say not a teleporter, but a replication machine, and just built a new you somewhere.
Right. So the thing that I find difficult with that, though, is we can't really mean we want it to have there somewhere be a conscious brain with all our memories and qualities and so on, because I don't have the memories and qualities of 15 years ago. Many of them are just gone, right?
Yeah.
So much of that is gone. And really, when I try, say, in a philosophy class, I ask, the students, okay, which of these things would you prefer? You get incinerated, but there's this molecule from molecule but replica made of you that, has all the memories and so on before that happened, or you get amnesia. Some kind of amnesia that doesn't really occur in real life, but where, your cognitive functions are fine, but you just don't remember anything. And they all would rather have amnesia. I mean, not all, but there is. Now, why is that? Is it because of some, sort of prejudiced way of thinking that, because we have such a close tie between one body, one person, we just need to think our way out of it? Or are they responding to something that isn't just what I remember or believe, or, right? There's this idea that what it is for me to continue is somehow something more than there just being contents of consciousness like the ones that I have now in the future, or these memories being continued.
Mm-hmm.
And so really, when I got into this, working on personal identity seriously, my question was, if you can't believe in some kind of metaphysical stream of consciousness for the reasons you just gave a minute ago, but you want to say there's somehow something more than just, somebody who's thinking the same thoughts you were thinking, or has the same beliefs, or can remember or have memory-like experiences of the same thing, what would that something more be? And that's kind of what I've been working on ever since, in one way or another.
Yeah.
But I keep coming back to the idea that it's there has to be some kind of holism to your experience. I mean, the problem is, in some ways I take Perfect's challenge to be something like this. Right now, you're just experiencing the present. You can't directly experience the past. You can't yet experience the future. You're just experiencing what's happening now. And in the next second, you'll experience what's happening then, and so on. And you can have memories and you can have anticipations, but all you ever experience is the now. So how could you ever get a stream of consciousness that would be anything more than saying this one is like the one before and that one's like the one before that, and so on. And the best answer I've been able to come up with is through an analogy to the way that a narrative is a whole, that is more than the sum of its parts.
Mm-hmm.
That somehow there's a continuity to a story where every moment, every event is sort of looking backward and sort of looking forward experientially, right? Each moment is just each moment, but we experience each moment as part of an ongoing life story, I think, which gives us a form of experience, a special form of experience of ourselves as continuing over time.
Yeah.
So that's what I out.
That's a very appealing addition to the notion of what it means to survive, because it certainly makes a lot of sense when you think about your narrative looking backwards and thinking this was me, and so there is a connection of some kind. Looking forwards, I find slightly more problematic because, of course, we can't really look forward. We can only imagine that we're looking forwards. We can make up something about what is there in the future. And this is where it also it seems to break down slightly in my experience with what people are okay with or not okay with when they think about survival. You mentioned how your students respond to the question of incineration and a copy versus amnesia, and that's an interesting one because when I talk to people in detail about this, eventually they often aren't quite so happy with the amnesia case, but yes, that's something it's a common first response is if the material is retained, if the body is still there, you survive, even if a lot of you is gone, if perhaps you might not even understand the language anymore or anything like that. But that's pretty much what it came down to, even in talking to other philosophers like Jeff McMahon and Paul Snowden, which is that typically they seem fine with two different types of scenarios. There's the scenario where the material is retained. So perhaps it's a scenario where you are unconscious, but you wake up, or you have some amount of dementia and it's still you, or you've changed over time, but your brain is there, or even you are stored at Alcor in a cryogenic storage of some kind, and then you're revived later and it's still you. That scenario seems fine. The other scenario is the one where you gradually replace pieces of the brain with perfect replicas. You replace every neuron, or you replace a part of the brain. It doesn't seem entirely clear which percentage you can replace at a time, or what the interval is, what the rate of replacement is that's okay. But as long as it's done in that gradual fashion, that seems fine. So the material itself really isn't the issue then, as long as there's some sort of gradualness to this. So this forward-looking narrative seems to make an issue out of that, about things like the rate of replacement. Because where it tends to break down is that once you make that replacement rate, or the percentage of how much is being replaced, very large, then the feeling is, well, at some point you don't survive. And I pressed Jeff McMahon on that. I asked him, so what rate is it? Where does it stop?
Right.
You're okay with replacing, say, 1 million neurons at a time every second or something like that, or you're okay with doing it every day if you want to take 1,000 years to replace your entire brain. but where does it stop? What's the rate when suddenly it's too fast? Because that's kind of the rate you get to when it becomes, at some point it's instantaneous, and then it's the same as the copy, as the replication of the entire brain. And it breaks down somewhere there, but it's very hard to put your finger on where exactly or why, and why that matters in this sort of account of what you feel is survival. In this, where I think narrative account is exactly what comes into play there. It's this sense of what you think is okay in terms of survival.
I do think it's exactly what do you think is okay, but it's not just what do you think is okay. It's what do you think is okay in a deep way in a cultural context. So let me say a bit more about that, because so having a narrative, because I always get this, how can you have a narrative? You don't know what's going to happen to you. When I talk about a narrative view of self, getting a sense of your life as a narrative, I guess I would think of it more as being in the middle of reading or writing a book than being the critic looking at the whole thing when you think about your life as a narrative. So what I mean by that is we just live our lives, I think, with a deep sense in the ordinary case. And then I will go, because I think that the narrative view makes it perfectly fine to replace brains and survive that. So in the end, but only in the right context. You have to be led to believe it for it to be true in a certain sense.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more about how you experience things and less about some metaphysical truth. So Parfit says, okay, no metaphysical truth about whether your consciousness continues. And I say, yes, but it could be a deep experiential truth. Just like people who think you can dissolve the self through meditation, like you probably can, right? Because you're not experiencing, I mean, if you get to achieve a state where you're not looking backward or forward, your consciousness is going to be really different than if you live like us, where we're always thinking backward and forward. So to say that you have a narrative sense of self, the way I think about it, so this is again where other people come in, is we just probably, partly for good evolutionary reasons, I mean, you could certainly make up a story if you wanted to, but also because of the way our lives are organized and socialization, we walk around with a really robust sense of ourselves as beings living a human life, from cradle to grave, and maybe beyond, and maybe before, but at least that, right? And so I think of myself when I was 1 year old, and I have no problem having that be part of my narrative, even though I don't remember any of that. Where I was born is part of my narrative, even though I don't remember it. So, right, I'm always walking around with this background story, which I'm always adding to. And one of the things that we experience all the time, not consciously, not reflectively, often consciously and reflectively, but much more just it's how we organize our life and interact with things, is with this rich knowledge of our historical background that brought us to this point and the way it affects what's happening now, and with the expectation that we're going to have a future. I mean, if you right now put a mask on when you go outside to walk around, it's because you think you're going to have a future and you might not want to be sick in it, right? All of these things, you don't have to think to yourself, I have a future. It's just that every moment, everything we look at. So when I sat down and, pointed the browser at the link, so much went into that already about my history, that we had made an appointment to do it, but that I've been working on personal identity for a long time, that this is a thing I do, this is my house, right? This is the place where I go if I'm going to boot up my computer. All of that is always going into a narrative. And so what I say is that we have a really robust sense of ourselves as continuing beings, continuing over time. And I think there's some, evidence of this in developmental psychology, that when preschoolers sort of start learning to self-narrate, it is also when they start, showing evidence of a sense of self and other, and, of other minds, and that
Hmm.
distinction. So I think, and also are able to think diachronically. I mean, it's when you can start learning to be prudent a little bit, right? Look forward to what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so you want the story to go on is the thing that I think is what you want in survival. But what counts as that sort of depends how far you can imaginatively project yourself into the future
Hmm.
past.
Yeah, I find this extremely appealing because it seems to solve, it seems to address the problem that there really isn't a very good physical, um, issue to point to when it comes to personal survival or personal continuity in any of these scenarios. Um, but there is this intuitive sense of what is okay and what isn't. And as you said, this has a lot to do with the narrative account and what we are used to, what we have this robust feeling about, which to me sounds like it's very much it's a cultural construct almost. It's something that maybe in some cultures could even be different than in our culture, and where some things that we would find not okay, others would find okay. For instance, for personal survival, it's even more interesting to me now in the sense of thinking, well, if as a child you learn to create a narrative where you start to care about the future, you start to care about tomorrow, and you might be cautious about something today to make a better tomorrow, that this, an evolutionary aspect to that. There's a sort of, this would have been good in a natural selection context to develop something like that, where there's a narrative, because you can start doing planning into the future, long-term planning, something that humans pride themselves on being good at compared to other animals, although we obviously still fail in many ways. Um, but it seems like there's then a sort of an evolutionary component to it, to why this would exist, this sense of self as something, a person continuing through time. Would you agree with that?
I I would. I mean, it's certainly outside of my area of expertise, but that's never stopped me before. So yeah, I do think that, and it does connect a little bit with the stuff about empathic access, because one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, and that there's a lot of interesting work on now, is why well, is about the nature of episodic memory. Memories where you sort of have images and affect, and you don't just, I don't just remember that I started school on such and such a day, but I remember, how the desk looked, and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
Um, and, some people, there's, a lot of work on why would we have evolved to have episodic memory, which other, creatures on the planet don't seem to have, although there's some dispute about that. I'm more interested in not exactly that piece of the evolutionary story, but I have my own, but about why we value them so much. I mean, people hate to lose their memories. They have scrapbooks, they take pictures, they reminisce, people differ on this. But I think it's because key part of the narrative for me is it's not just that you can tell the story of your history or these facts about your past, but you can, in some sense, re-experience them, right? There are parts of yourself you can keep alive, and this is something, it's the kind of thing where that song comes on the radio and suddenly you're right back there and you're like, okay, I can still, so that past moment of consciousness isn't actually gone. I mean, in some sense it's gone, but it's almost as if you're experiencing the past. And I think we can do something similar to the future. It's different, but it's an analog. I remember, I was so excited when I was trying to write about this. There's this great quote where Lady Macbeth says, "I feel the future in the instant." And she's imagining when they're going to be in power, right? So she's already feeling the pleasure of what it's going to be like right now. So it's not a purely cognitive thing. It's you can right now get pleasure or pain from sort of, this episodic memory, and Tolton called it mental time travel. And
Yeah.
now there's a lot of work on the way in which simulating the future is a lot like remembering the past. This sort of imaginative ability to think of yourself over time and the arc of your story and so on has an effect on you right now. So that's the way in which I try to get consciousness out of just this moment and extend it over time. And then the question is, so like if you live, I mean, so I do think it's hard to do it without the rest of the culture going along, but maybe some individuals can. But like if you live in a culture where people routinely get a new body after X amount of time, well, then you're going to be socialized into imagining, right, but 3 bodies from now, you're going to be sorry that you did that. Or when you get your new brain, you'll feel better, so just stick it out now, or, whatever.
Yeah.
And so you can get the narrative arc going longer and over more material. I don't see anything to rule it out.
It's interesting how this connects with something that we discussed on a very recent journal club that we did, because we've had a whole series going on where we've been trying to figure out consciousness and personal identity from the perspective of all these futurist scenarios. And so we did a workshop and we did a number of other steps and stages in learning. And at the end of the last journal club that was about this topic, one thing that actually Michael, who is here doing the technology side of things, asked at one point, because he still personally struggles with this notion of, which kind of a mind uploading procedure could you survive? Could you only survive a gradual replacement, or could you survive the sort that we call scan and copy, where you just copy into a new brain? And he was wondering at the end, after having discussed all of the details of, say, what we might call the physical aspects of what makes a person and what has to continue or doesn't, and these differences that one can debate there. He was asking, so at this point, is there still more we can discover? Is there something more we can actually bring onto the table here to find out if there really is an issue here or not? Or do I just have to learn to accept it or get used to it for it to work? And my answer isn't that I gave him at the time is completely irrelevant, but it sounds almost like what you're saying is that indeed it does matter whether he's used to it. It matters whether you're acculturated to the idea.
Right, and what I want to say is that's not a shallow thing. People say, well, that's just a constructionist thing, then it doesn't matter, you exist, you don't exist, you can just make it up. But I don't think the culture is like that, right? That's like saying, oh, you could grieve your dead, you could not grieve your dead, you just make that up, right? It's like, it's a deeper thing than that. And it's different experientially. And if you're talking about, your consciousness continuing, then what matters is what your experience is like. And if it's possible that your experience overall is very different with scan and copy in, now than it would be in 200 years, then whether you can survive it or not is going to be different now than in 200 years, because the experience is the fact, right?
Yeah.
For something like consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I guess a medical person would almost say there's a placebo effect to consciousness and continuity. You have to believe
Actually,
it.
I ended up writing a paper about deep brain stimulation and identity, just, because somebody brought it to my attention. And there was an issue, there was a conference about would you survive the deep brain stimulation. Sometimes people have these very radical and very sudden changes in personality, it seems like. So, the sort of fictionalized case study was someone who could be going for Parkinson's or depression, but after, deep brain stimulation, suddenly they have this extremely radical change in personality. And especially for depression, I guess apparently sometimes it's very difficult not only for the patient to get used to, but to families who have been, dealing with someone who is practically unable to get out of bed, who's now suddenly energetic and self-sufficient in these ways. And so one of the things I thought is, well, it depends on, so whether from the outside it looks like you've just turned somebody into someone else in some scary, nefarious way, depends on whether you tell the story just about what happened, sort of as it were in the operating room, or whether you tell the long story of someone's struggle with depression and all the things they tried and how they finally came to this, and they knew this was going to happen, and they knew there would be a period of adjustment on the other side, and here it is, just as it was predicted. And if you tell the longer story, it suddenly looks like, yes, a longer story can contain a radical break. And, like people always say, but what about things like conversion? It's like, well, the story of the Apostle Paul is like not the story of the Apostle Paul. Let's use somebody else first, right? That's
that makes a lot of sense.
So, but I also think that in the case of something like deep brain stimulation, then you would think that, so it matters how you prepare the patient to think about the story of what's happening both before and after, and to remind people afterward of what the story was before, and to link those up. But again, it has to be not just a sort of story you can tell cognitively or reflectively, but something you can internalize.
Yeah, it sounds like you have to care a lot about what we might call trauma on either the, say, physical end, like let's say you don't get your replica quite right, and there are a lot of things different, or on the preparation end, on the side of being able to continue, say that this fits into your narrative of your continuing self. So avoid trauma at all costs.
Although now that you say that, that's funny, because if I had the intuition that I could survive replication, I would think the replica could be pretty screwed up and still be me. Not because I think it's screwed up in different ways than I, right? It's like, it doesn't have to be perfect.
So it seems like the narrative part of it then takes precedence over the physical part. That's the more important piece. Okay, in
terms of the experience, unless it just turns out, which this is part of the reason I say it's an empirical question, if it turns out that our brains evolved in such a way that, human lifespans are just salient units that we can't psychologically get past, okay, that could be a problem. But that's because the narrative takes precedence.
Yeah, this has been extremely interesting. Now, usually when we get to the point where, let's say, we've talked for a sufficiently long time and we've kind of discussed all these points, then I tend to ask, well, is there anything else that you feel that people should know that we haven't talked about? But before we jump in there, in this case, because it so happens that Michael's right here, and I was just mentioning his discomfort and what it feels like I was speaking on his behalf or trying to make, I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't attempt to speak for him when he's right here. Did I get that right? Is there some other bit about this that you would like to ask or say, Michael?
Yeah, I think you explained my position quite well. I do have this fixation that there has to be some other level of continuity to mind uploading when it comes to personal survival, something that has a higher continuity than scan and copy, because I have trouble seeing the continuity in the self going from just a continuity of information. Like one of the example scenarios that I like to use is where the biological self survives the scanning procedure completely, and the emulation of the mind is created. I don't really see how it could be right for the biological self to think that he he achieved that sense of life extension or survival through an emulation, especially when when the biological self has complete continuity, and he like can witness or see the emulation. I don't necessarily see how how his narrative in this case could continue through that emulation. It seems like it's just cut off, or like a completely new narrative is created in that copy or that emulation. And so I like the discussion that personal identity seems to be shouldn't be taken just as like an unnecessary thing, like something that you should just forget completely and just accept that minimal level of continuity. And so then one issue that I see is when it comes to the technological challenge to having a mind uploading procedure that is widely accepted. I can see how that's going to be, if you're going to go with the process that it has to adhere to each individual's personal sense of narrative, which I would be happy with if that was possible. But then when you're turning that into like a technological or engineering challenge, it seems like that's going to have different complications for each individual, because the more continuity that you have to include in the mind uploading procedure, the more difficult that it is. And so, I mean, I could see how that might be just a problem that can't be circumvented. But like as far as is that something that, I guess my question then ultimately is, when you're talking about the challenge of creating a successful mind upload that does have a widely accepted preservation of personal identity, does that mean that the procedure is going to have to be different to suit the individual and adhere to their sense of personal narrative?
That's a big question. So, because what it presses me on is what is a sense of personal narrative, right? And so here's a way of thinking about it. I mean, well, it's very helpful. It opens up a whole new can of worms. So like, when it's time to stop talking, just tell me.
Yeah, I apologize.
No,
No problem on our end.
Really getting to, and I didn't even see this myself, so you pressed me on this, because it does go back to the very first distinction I made, and how much of this is going on outside of you in your sort of culture and so on, how much work is getting done from the outside and from people recognizing you and treating you as the same person and so on. Because one of the problems I have with the narrative you that I've never solved is then it sounds like if you don't think you would survive replication, if someone replicates you, whether you survive or not depends on whether you find out they did, right? They replicate you and take the person off to another planet, you never know it. You'll keep narrating your story just the same. But if you see the replica, then you'll get all freaked out and it will disrupt your story, right? But that can't be right. It can't be, or at least it needs more explanation. And so I think this is how it goes back to the notion of identity and oneness and what's special about oneness and all that. One of the things that kept coming back to me when I was working on this is, well, I started out thinking that what I wanted was my consciousness to continue, that would be survival. I mean, the whole thing is like, so how do you keep this mortality thing? Well, there's got to be some way for your consciousness to continue. And then what I realized is, well, I don't just want my consciousness to continue. I want my life to continue. I mean, it's not just knowing things and experiencing things. It's living my life but what does that mean? Because life can change a lot over time. And I did, for a while, spend a lot of time looking at some stuff on refugees and displaced person things. So, like, if your whole life just gets sort of shut down, right, and you get displaced, so that you really don't have, you know, the family you had, or the friends you had, or the country you had, or any of the things that sort of gave shape and structure to your life, what happens to you and what happens to your sense of identity? And that turns out to be very messy. Because people are really different and circumstances are really different. So I didn't learn anything there, but I think a lot of the idea of a narrative does sort of have a notion of oneness, singleness in it. There's one story going on here, and if it breaks off into two storylines, what do you do about that? So I mean, I think in some sense, like the narrative sense of self comes for free if you upload the mind, because I think to have a mind like ours, you have this, I mean, that the kind of mind that people have where we're worrying about our survival, you've already got that future and backward looking. How long is this going to last? And can it go on past the death? I mean, once you're asking those questions, you've got a narrative. You're thinking of your life as a narrative. So wanting your life to go on is like wanting the story to go on. I don't want the story to end, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you think of mind uploading, you get a narrative sense of self, but then there's the duplicate. I mean, plus you get all the backstory. I mean, the particular story would be there if you uploaded the memories and so on. It isn't a separate thing that you would upload. But one of the questions is, I mean, there's the question of how many could you make. There's also a question of how different a vehicle could the upload, right, go to. So that's another question I ask students to get at this sort of life versus consciousness thing. Is it okay if it's just like on a server somewhere? Does it have to feel like you're in a world? If it is just on a server somewhere and you have to like feel like you're in the world doing things, which activities could you give up? What kinds of, you know, and still think that you are continuing your life? Could it be disembodied? Could it be in a really different body? When does the narrative break? So I don't know if that really answered your question, but it's, I think, a way of saying, I mean, I think the summary of it would be what more you want than the mental upload might not come from something internal, but from about how the thing with the mental upload, what it can do with that mental upload, what's available to it, right? More from whether that's enough to continue living a life in a sense.
So in a sense, it would matter, for example, if, let's say, in Michael's example, if your biological self survives the procedure and that's how you made a duplicate, and now the surroundings are saying, well, you know, you're still here, so you are still this person who owns that house and lives with that person and goes to that school and whatnot. And I guess the upload is somebody else. So it's almost the surrounding reaction that reinforces this notion that the upload is a different person and isn't just as much you as the biological self. But if you hadn't survived, because there would only be that other one, everyone would point there and say, well, that must be the survival of Michael. That must be the one who belongs in that house. And therefore, that's the correct surviving Michael. And that does sound really counterintuitive in the sense that it can't depend on that. I mean, again, this is a matter of, do we even know whether or not we were duplicated or not, you know? but it feels as if that's what it comes down to. It's kind of your ability, as you said, your ability to continue living the life the way that you expect, or in that story that you're creating. Hmm.
Yeah,
So yeah, I mean,
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say it is counterintuitive, and I certainly have my moments when I also think it can't just be that, because there are so many ways that you could come up with stories where people were mistaken about which one was was the original body,
Hmm.
right? There's some mistake about that. Does that mean that in the one case the original biological body is, and in the other case it isn't? That's why I think in a world where we didn't have well-established practices for dealing with things like this, I think we would just be stymied and not know what to say. But it does seem like there has to be a fact of the matter whether we know what to say or not, and that's why it's so troubling.
Yeah, yeah.
Didn't solve it, not yet.
Or maybe we would just learn to stop worrying about it and accept it and say, this is another kind of uncertainty, like the uncertainty principle. But I'm joking really, because I don't think it's quite as you can't just run roughshod about over this question. Um, but we hadn't really taken the cultural component into account at all in our previous discussion. So this is a completely unique and new addition to our thoughts about the problem. Hmm. Yeah.
So
So
is
yeah.
the 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 uh, the reproduction of the body in total, like you would have a copy of the body that the same body, I mean, qualitatively the same.
Sorry, was that a question or?
Well, to go back to the question I asked before, could you think of a mind, when you're thinking about mind upload,
Yeah.
is it always into a duplicate body, or could it be in some?
When I think about it, I think about, I mean, I guess I think about all the various possibilities, because some of them sound very enticing. It would be really interesting if you could switch bodies any day you wanted to, or, you know, um, try out different things. And there seems to be at least some support for the idea that you can survive at least some type of change of body, because you know there are people who lose limbs, or who become used to doing something like, let's say a professional kayaker, or someone who's really good at kayaking, may sometimes feel as if the kayak is part of their body when they're making their way through the water. It just feels as natural as walking. And you could say the same thing about driving a car. If you're used to doing that, it feels like the car is almost an extension of yourself, and you know exactly where it ends and which corners you can make and which ones you can't. Um, so it feels like there's some room for uh, physical changes, and you can probably play with that even now through something like virtual reality, where you can try out the experience of being in a different type of body, and just how strange, how unlike yourself that might or might not feel. I don't really have a good sense for the degree that's acceptable there. Like, again, whether or not some sort of trauma there matters or doesn't matter. So it feels like that's more of an experimental question, uh, an empirical one, and not so much one that I could figure out right now.
And it leads to another suggestion that Parfit makes, which is that survival might be the kind of thing that could be a matter of degree. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it may be that it's not like either your consciousness continues or it doesn't, but it could be, and this goes back to the sort of episodic memory, empathic access thing. It could be you hold on to some parts of your life and you can reproduce them and get them back, um,
Hmm.
and others you can't. So, maybe your 14-year-old self survived, but your 20-year-old self didn't, or, I mean, in
Yeah,
some.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of my 14-year-old self that survived is really just a figment of my imagination anyway, just a likely self that I'm regenerating from a few disparate memories that I have, or even things that other people have told me about myself. So it's, yeah, when you talk about time spans like that, it all becomes rather disjointed and subjective. Yeah. So this has been extremely interesting, and now I guess I do get to ask you, is there something that we forgot to talk about? Anything that should be mentioned?
Oh, no, I can't think of anything except that I think it just shows again, I mean, one of the joys of doing philosophy is I've long since given up on the idea that any of these questions is going to get answered in a satisfactory way, but I just think you can learn so much by trying and following out the different twists and turns. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to think about some of this stuff again.
Yeah. But I guess
Really
you could
interested
look
to
forward in a near-term future. Perhaps you will also be asked to be I guess an ethical advisor for the sorts of things that can be tried in empirical settings at that point. Um, Even if you don't really know the answers, they might ask you, well, is this okay? Is that okay? Given your take on personal identity, that may still come along.
Yeah, well, it would be interesting to think about. There are certainly a lot of questions. So that was great.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This was an extremely enlightening conversation to me. It definitely brought a whole new angle into our conversations around personal identity. It was a great pleasure talking to you.
Oh, well, it was really good talking to you too, and yeah, good luck with everything. I'm glad we finally connected, and I'm glad that the buzz went away.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right.
All right,
That's a wrap.
thanks.